to welcome everyone to a podcast on Jeff Oberdorfer, a sage architect. And today's recording is about looking back. How did Jeff become an architect? What was his goals? And just giving you a little background. He has an intriguing history. And what I'm going to start with is just saying a few things about who Jeff is. Jeff has supported many types of community and neighborhood gathering places. He's created viable solutions for what he called livable streets and invoked authentic community participation. He's been instrumental in historical restorations and has worked within small towns to urban planning in his career. He's pioneered the integration of green vegetable roofs, what we call living roofs, and sustainable, affordable architecture has been his love. And he's developed socially responsible housing. He's been an advocate for what was called and developed the first set aside in California for developmentally disabled tenants. And he's even initiated eco-pass programs to provide free transit and light rail, which speaks to his dedication to envisioning community and dynamic, inclusive public spaces. I'm really excited to have Jeff here to talk about his past and to also talk about all the future things he sees with cradle-to-cradle green materials and responsibly sourced materials, which are so viable and essential in today's world. So, hi, Jeff.
Hello.
And I'm Liz Cook, and Jeff and I have been friends and cohorts and family for many, many years. And so I know a lot about Jeff, and as a somatic educator, I want people to recognize that buildings affect the way we feel, the way we sense ourselves, the way we experience life, whether we feel included, whether we feel that we have agency. It affects so many pieces of living in the world that we don't really think about. And you know, it's like whether we live in a roundhouse or a square house, or how we walk through public spaces and how do they speak to us and how do we speak to them. So today we're going to delve into a little bit of looking back. So Jeff, tell us what intrigued you about architect as a young man.
Well, I was lucky enough to have a high school class in architecture. And until I took that class, I had no idea what I wanted to do. So that class, the drafting, the model making, that really kind of convinced me at the last minute in high school that that's what I wanted to do.
And why did you choose Kent State University's architecture school?
Well, that was kind of seriously by accident. I was not a very good student in high school. And until I was a senior, I didn't even know I wanted to be an architect. So I had no motivation to prepare myself educationally by studying. So I was called an underachiever in high school. Yeah. And I had a hard time then getting into architecture schools because of that. So I went to the University of Toledo for a year to study industrial design and graphics. And I did it well enough that I could transfer to another school. And I transferred to an Ohio school to keep all my credits. And Kent State at the time was really well known for having a very solid educational curriculum.
That's great. And along with going there for, what, 5 years, you were part of an honors program that really affected, I think, your perception of architecture. Would you say that's true?
It gave me the ability to explore architecture in a way that the curriculum didn't allow me to. Mm-hmm. I was really discouraged from doing the kind of work I was interested in architecture school because I was breaking the mold.
And what was that? What were you interested in?
Well, I was intrigued by a course called medical sociology. And I don't know why. I don't remember why, but I remember the instructor's name. And we got into the class and we went around the room introducing ourselves. It was probably 30 students, and they were all people in recreation and nursing.
Oh, wow.
And I was the only architect.
Oh, wow.
And the first thing that the instructor said is, thank God architects are starting to get interested in this stuff.
Yes.
And the readings for that course were two books that changed everything that I thought about in architecture. One was called The Hidden Dimension by Edward Hall, who was an anthropologist, who talked about the different ways that different cultures relate to each other and to space, and why there's conflicts, for instance, between Westerners and the Middle East because of the way they talk. In the Middle East, they talk very close to your face, whereas the United States, we stand back more. And there's all kinds of things about this. And also the other book was Robert Summers' book, Personal Space, where he talked about how students in classrooms and patients in hospitals did better depending on whether they had a window or where they were sitting in the classroom.
Wow.
Luckily, I had two instructors that were really excited about this. And one became my advisor. And as I studied this more and more, and because I had gotten my liberal arts credentials out of the way at Toledo, he recommended me for the Honors College to do independent study. At the same time, his name was John Flynn. He wrote the textbook on lighting that we had at the time, and was a consultant at GE in Nela Park, Cleveland. And he would take me up there to look at some of the light experiments, and I became interested in colored light. That's what I wrote my thesis on. And that really spurred me on to get interesting jobs at other architects during the summer as interns, and also my beginning teaching. When I left school and went to Boston, Cambridge, I taught classes on spatial design about how people react to the physical environment. And I had students from MIT, from Harvard. They were not getting that at any architectural school.
Right.
So that kind of started me on a different track than many architects at the time.
Yes, I'm fascinated as a somatic educator, the idea that architects don't really think about how the room affects our physicality, how it affects our feelings and our sensation and our experience of interacting with other people within that space. Do you want to say more about what you discovered in taking those classes, and how it affected, you in the way you started to design buildings or look at spaces, especially some of the community stuff you've done?
I think that some of the things that were happening in architecture schools at the time, especially conservative schools like Kent State, I mean, socially conservative schools, nobody was dealing with these issues.
Yeah.
Now they are now, 40 or 50 years later. There was one group that did respond to these kind of issues. It was called the Environmental Design Research Association, or EDRA. And these were architects and people involved in building that were concerned with these issues. They were researchers, academics, and they also were very supportive of participatory design. Because what was coming out of this is that if the environment affects us that much, that we have the right to participate in its design.
Wow. Wait, just pause there for a minute. That's like huge. Say that again. If
the environment impacts us the way we know it does, then we have a right to participate in the impacts it creates.
Yes. Yes, that is huge.
So that's when I met people at EDRA like Henry Sanoff, who was doing all kinds of participatory work in North Carolina and in Poland and throughout Europe. And he became a mentor as well with the Environmental Design Research Association, which still exists.
Talk a little bit about how participatory architecture is, or design is like what that really means to you.
Well, when I first started doing it, and also I certainly wasn't the only one. There were very few architects doing it. Henry Sanoff was one. There's also Larry Halpern, who was
Yeah.
doing the RSVP cycles, where he and his wife, who was a dancer, would take people on these trips to kind of open them up with dance and movement.
Yes.
And he designed all kinds of landscape sculptures and gardens that were involved with people's real needs. And he was really a leader in that way. And I met him once or twice, but his books were really, really important to me.
Right. And Anna Halpern did a lot with taking dance and bringing it to community as ways of expressing what community needs. And so she brought it into equity,
Exactly.
social justice, and
Exactly.
yes.
So
Wow.
they were a perfect combination up in Northern California to mix dance with architecture.
Yeah. Yes, dancing in spaces, moving not in cubbies like a mouse, but moving in where space becomes something you're interacting with.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And so, how did that kind of that combination with the lighting, I think is really interesting because your research was done on the psychological effects of lighting. Speak to that. Like, what does that mean? How do you understand that?
Well, I was also, when I graduated and I started teaching at Tufts and the Boston Museum School, I'd have students do experiments with models, like design an abstract model that makes people sad. Design an abstract model that makes people elated.
Oh,
And you would see students coming up with models that were deep red and orange with jagged spaces that were what they call psychotic spaces. And then they would design spaces that were more heart oriented, which tended to be warmer colors and less aggressive shapes. And at the same time, in college, I was communicating with a psychologist in Saskatchewan, and he was experimenting with the shapes of buildings in hospitals and how that impacted his clients. And he was working with an architect also in Saskatchewan, and they would take LSD and walk through the clinics where the schizophrenics were and identify what kind of architectural qualities were either making them at ease or making them more psychotic.
wow.
So for instance, like reflective glass
Oh,
would
yes.
really bother somebody,
Yes.
or long hallways and tunnels that look like they were never ending.
Yes.
And this kind of freaked out some of the clients. I was also communicating with a couple of other ecological psychologists, they were called at the time, Roger Barker in Kansas, and then another fellow in New Jersey, who was hypnotizing people and telling them either they had an expanded present or no future or an expanded past. And he would look at how people responded to these commands of what time meant to them. And all these people were amazingly gracious to me because they were so excited to have a young architect interested in this. They would write me long letters answering my comments that were just amazing. And I would show them to my advisors at Kent in the Honors College, and they were just blown away.
Yeah.
Just blown away. But yeah, that's kind of how I got started thinking about psychology in space.
Yes. Yes. And how that affects you talked about anthropology, and I think that's a really also intriguing because so many people think that space is what they perceive it as in regard to, for example, the Western world, right? And so any other culture, any other, say, an indigenous nation, would view space differently than a Western European would. And so that whole idea that when we have public space and there's people from all over the world, or there's people from different cultural backgrounds, are all sharing a space together, how does that space then influence the way they interact with life? How is it like shaping us? Like, how is space changing us? And you use the, psychological aspect, but also kind of a sense of safety, or a sense of expansion, or a sense of welcoming or inclusion.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it has to do with where you grow up, obviously. So for instance, I grew up in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
People in New York City are considered arrogant and aloof.
Mm-hmm.
But they're really not. They're very kind people. It's just that when you have 8 million people in a city, you may not ever see that person again. So you're going to kind of lay things out. And then when I moved to Ohio, I found myself walking through the hallways in the schools in Ohio, stepping on people's ankles because I walked faster than people in the Midwest. And after 6 years in the Midwest, when I went back to the East Coast, people were stepping on my ankles because I had adopted to the pace of life in Ohio.
Right.
Likewise, people in the Mideast tend to talk to each other with their face and nose very close together.
Right.
Whereas people on the West, especially the United States, stand 3 to 5 feet away from each other. You can see that the way people sit on benches.
Mm.
You can have a 6-foot bench, but no more than 2 people would ever sit on it.
Right.
That's not necessarily true in the Mideast.
Yes.
So those are the kind of cultural things. So in designing spaces, urban spaces, you really have to provide enough of those kinds of spaces that satisfy each one of these kind of arrangements.
So you really have to be thinking, you already have to be maybe responsive or conscious enough to recognize that your perception isn't what everyone else's perception is.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's a degree of empathy in there, but there's also the research is out there.
Aha.
And it's been out there since the 60s when Edward Hall wrote his book and Robert Summer wrote his.
Yes. Yes. So it's really about a resurgence. And there is a resurgence in the LSD research that is reshaping our understanding of self and other and social physical community. So you yourself experimented a lot with LSD as a young man. And so tell listeners about some of your brief interactions with you mentioned they're researchers while attending architecture school. How did your experiments affect your understanding of psychological use of space and form?
Well, because when you do certain kinds of hallucinogenic drugs, you have no choice. But, as an architect, thinking about these things and seeing how color impacted people, to watch people deal with how they work in space deals with people, and to have the background of other researchers, like the fellow who was an architect in Saskatchewan, who was walking through mental hospitals taking acid. I already had that background from reading his materials, so it just fit right in with my more less academic pursuit of hallucinogenics, which of course
you were really disciplined in your use of LSD. You had a kind of schedule of when you would allow yourself to go into that. You weren't reckless with it.
No, I had to be, because
that was set up for studying it.
There's no way you can do architectural work when you're hallucinating. It just doesn't happen. There's no way to draft for 15 hours for a project. So it was definitely done to complement my thinking in architecture, but it was not done in an academic or controlled setting like they are now with microdosing and things like that. So those drugs, you know, and there was researchers out doing books like Charles Tart talking about altered states of consciousness. This was really being experimented with a lot, not only by people like Ram Dass and others, but by researchers in labs who are talking about, you know, what does this do to your perception? So I certainly wasn't an academic researcher in that realm, but it did create a lot of perception about how people related to space, how I related to space. It also opened me up socially, became more empathetic. Because it was very much also a group process. If you knew some people that you were close to and you were doing these kind of hallucinogenics together, it really created a bond.
Yes, yes.
But it just kind of woke me up, which was that the whole 60s, late 60s was about anyway. So the culture was kind of about that. And it was way ahead of architecture schools, you know, because they used to tell me in architecture school that you have to decide whether you want to be an architect or a sociologist. And I would say, why can't I just be a good architect?
Yeah.
And they started inviting people from the psychology and sociology departments to my critiques. They were normally just done by architects.
Oh, wow.
And they would give me straight A's. And the architects would say, what the hell are you doing? This doesn't make any sense, you know, like, so what I would do, for instance, we had a project. This is an interesting story. The superintendent of schools in Cleveland decided that the way to get around racism in schools was to build one giant school in Cleveland, and everybody was bused to that school. And that was our assignment. I didn't agree with that assignment because it made no sense to me. Neighborhood schools made a lot more sense. And there was no way in architecture school to argue with the program. That was it. This is what's, so I wrote to Roger Barker, who had written a book called Ecological Psychology, and he's considered the father of ecological psychology. And he also wrote a book called Big School, Small School. And I wrote to him and I asked him about what he thought about this and the fact that I thought it was wrong. And he wrote me back, and then don't forget, this is before the internet. We're working on, you know, horrible typewriters, you know, so it takes a long time to write a letter. And for these people to write a letter to a young student was just amazing. So Roger Barker wrote me a letter on the University of Kansas stationery that explained the difference between big schools and small schools and said that it's really great that young architects like you are interested in this, and your proposal to do small neighborhood schools is absolutely correct. And he signed a letter by saying, don't hesitate to be radical.
Oh, wow.
So I photostated that letter and mounted it on my presentation boards and presented it at my jury. And it blew people's minds.
Yeah.
Nobody had ever challenged the program before. So right away, I was labeled the troublemaker.
Yeah.
But my advisor said, you know, challenging the program is something fairly sophisticated. And the fact that Jeff went out and got one of the leading researchers in the United States to respond, that is academic work that's valuable.
Yes.
You know, and he supported me.
Good.
So one person out of what, 15 architects on staff, the other people just thought I was crazy.
Yeah, well, innovative people are often called crazy.
Yeah.
And you're a very, very innovative man. So you've done a lot of amazing things. I wanted to circle back a moment because some of your jobs when you were summer jobs, didn't you work for NASA or you worked somewhere in New York that was really—
Because of the work I had done on color perception and lighting, I got an internship over the summer with a firm in New York City, Warner Burns, Tone and Lundy, great firm, that was on 5th Avenue and 57th Street. So it was a really nice firm. I really liked working there. I used to commute in, and they hired me because there was a competition at the time between select providers of aerospace products like Grumman's and Boeing. And each of them had hired a team of architects to work with them to compete for the job doing habitability studies for zero gravity space shuttles.
Gotcha.
So here I was just coming out of May 4th killings at Kent State to start work in June for this architectural firm in New York City. And we worked with Grumman's on Long Island and would meet with their engineers and do all these sketches and color selections for the space shuttles.
Mm. Wow, what an amazing job.
And I was 20 years old.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about the killings at Kent State, because they happened right in front of the architecture building, did they not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you want to share about that experience for you and how it affected your perception? And
Well, just a little background. Kent State, as you know, is a suitcase school. At least it was then. It may not be now. It's a good school, but people would stay in the dorms, go home on the weekends and come back. And there's maybe 2,000 students on campus at any one time. There's 21,000 students total at the time. There's more now. So to have 10,000 state troopers and Army Guard people from the National Guard show up with tanks and guns was such an overkill, pardon the pun, but it was an overreaction, politically staged for that reason.
yes.
And the architecture school at that time was up on a hill, and the commons were students, basically it was student common space.
Yes.
Anytime a student rang the bell, there could be all kinds of groups there, and it was not space that was ever invaded or we were told what to do with it. It was just a common open space. And the issue was that the National Guard said that the students didn't have a right to protest in this open space that was traditionally theirs. And they declared martial law. And so the killings happened. Nobody knew that the National Guard had loaded ammunition. Some of the students that were wounded or killed were like 500 yards away walking to class. I mean, this was totally arbitrary. It could have been me, it could have been anybody.
Right.
But what was surprising afterwards, coming back to my last year of school the year after, was the assignment was to do something in urban design that brought the community together. So I did these diagrams of how to bring the downtown Kent area together with the campus, which was about a mile away from downtown. And that freaked people out because nobody knew what to do about it. You know, that time with killings on campus, there was no kind of response that there are now with high school students, where they have people who are trained in therapy and dogs that are trained to make people feel more relaxed. There was none of that. There were no colloquiums, there was no discussion. It was like something had happened and people wanted to make believe it didn't. And it was not a discussion in the architectural department about the reality of the fact that the open space that was common open space was taken for no reason other than this political maneuver by Nixon and the governor of Ohio. So that made me realize, first of all, in community planning and urban design, the importance of common space.
Yes.
That is owned by people. And that was not something that was talked about at the time, was common space. Urban design was not that sophisticated. There was no real empathy. There was no real cross-cultural issues happening in most cities. They were a little bit in New York because of such a diverse population. But throughout most of the unurban or non-urban areas in the country, I mean, there were newspaper articles saying that they're glad these bums were killed. It was the beginning of this with the Vietnam War, this kind of us versus them mentality, and the fact that middle-class students could be shot down on campus, the country was divided about whether that was right or wrong. And right after that, at Jackson State, several Black students were killed. And you know that this would never happen at Harvard or Yale or Berkeley. This happened at middle-class state schools. No endowments, no rich parents, you know.
Wow, that's quite a story. And you know what I'm hearing is how it affected your sense of space, of urban space, and the idea that it's not just the buildings in the urban space and the pathways, it's the spaces we share as people, and that you're really designing for people. That's the sociology and the anthropology that the architect may or may not think about.
Well, they are now.
Yeah.
There's tremendous amount of really good work happening now. So it's important to remind people viewing this that this was in the 60s and early 70s that I'm talking about. Yeah, it's amazing when you go to Europe and you see these large common areas that are surrounded by these beautiful old historic buildings, and people in the evening go for strolls and sit there for hours. We don't have too much of that in the United States. We're starting to talk about that.
Long anywhere. Yeah, it's like
we're starting to talk about that now. I mean, in Santa Cruz, where I live, there's a discussion about wanting a community commons where these kind of events could take place. In Cambridge, where I lived before, there was some large public parks that were used for that reason.
Yes.
So there are kind of situations like that that allow that to happen. And there's many, many books out now on learning from Europe and how you create those kind of spaces. The Dutch architects tend to be way ahead of us on that. You know, they came up with co-housing, they came up with the Woonerf, you know, the livable streets. So cultures that are more empathetic and social tend to be way ahead of us that way.
Yeah. How interesting. Yeah, the value of being together and gathering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, this was insightful, and this is just one of many podcasts. We're going to discuss lots of different issues, but this I wanted to be our first because I wanted to look back at the extraordinary young man who did all these things at such a young age and who just intuitively kept following something. I don't know if you would say you felt led or you were curious or the drugs made you do it. I don't know, but something got you going there where you kept peeling back these different pieces, or maybe it's including these pieces.
That was more of my nature. The drugs didn't do it. They helped when I first was doing it, but it was really, I think, some of the people, especially in the social and ecological fields, who supported me when I was young, opened me up. If I didn't have that kind of support system from academics around the country that were willing to take their time to respond to me, you know, that kind of wisdom.
Yeah.
You know, that's really what I consider what got me started. And I just started pushing from then on.
Well, and that's part of what these podcasts are, is to introduce you to a wide range of people so that people recognize what a mentor you are at this point, what a resource and that you can provide because of the wealth of your experience in exploring all these different dynamics of what it means to be an architect. So thanks for doing that.
Oh, thanks for talking to me, Liz.
Yeah. Goodbye for now.